Well, hello Jafffa junkies. Welcome to another episode of the 79 series bonnet scoop installation on the 200 bonnet. This episode we're going to get dusty and we're going to learn all about sandpaper grits and paint and primers and sanding blocks and all the rest of it. We're getting to the pointy end now where you've really got to spend the time to get a proper finished job, and nothing's more important than this final bodywork. So picking up from our prior episodes, we've sprayed a guide coat onto this bonnet, and that was just our etch primer. And now we're going to take a 120 grit block and we're going to sand that off. And what we're trying to accomplish here is we're trying to determine where the high spots are and where the low spots are on the bonnet. And that'll allow us to start targeting where we're going to be putting in some fill or doing some panel beating. So let's get stuck into it and see what we can find with these blocks. Here's an example of what we're looking for. So that's just a 120 grit paper on a flat sanding block. And as you can see, we've got this sort of crosshatch pattern. And this part of the panel looks pretty good. There's no real high and low spots on it. That part of the panel, you can see a massive low spot right there. So I'll hop underneath the panel and see whether I can knock that out from the bottom side. If I can't, because of the double skin, then that's going to be one area that we're going to have to fill. We know we're going to run filler around the perimeter of this bonnet scoop. That's a given. But what we're trying to do here is determine where we're going to have to put filler on the larger panel itself. And that's what we're looking for, these areas of shallowness. So that's going to be one area that we're going to have to do a little bit of work on. The other thing that this does, using 120 grit paper, is it sort of cross hatches this panel. And by cross hatching that panel, it gives us something that our high build primer can bite onto when we spray this bonnet down with primer. Alright, so I've just gone around and felt underneath of each of these low spots to see whether I could see whether I could get to them from the back side, and I can't. So that rules out, for me, panel beating those out. So it looks like it's going to have to be filler. Okay, now I'm going to hit the panel with some wax and grease remover. Now I'm no expert in body work. The worst spots are going to be my targets to start off with. Alright, we've got our hardener, and you just make sure you knead that because it can separate. So knead it, especially if it's been sitting for a long time. And this can of Bondo I've got here has been sitting for a very long time, so I suspect it's going to have all settled out. I'll open that up. And the other thing that you need is something to do the mixing on. Now these are kind of a wax coated paper called onion mixing boards. So that's what I'm going to use. Probably best that you don't use cardboard. And the reason for that is the oils in the Bondo and in the hardener get pulled out in the cardboard because the cardboard's so porous and so dry. Apart from the fact that it needs a stir. It's in bloody great shape, but I can separate it out too much. It's a good creamy consistency, and there's no lumps in it. The other thing you'll need is something like that. That's a little plastic Bondo knife to force the Bondo into the areas that you want it to go. All right, we're going to have to do this multiple times. Okay, got our next bit of Bondo. Mix mix up. Just knead it, knead it, knead it. Once I'm finished putting this primary layer on, you want to get in and you want to sand it, or start to sand it pretty quickly. At least initially with some high grit or some coarse grit paper like an 80 grit to get any of the real high spots off. All right, there we go. There's that low spot that we found with our guide coat. So we'll fill that in as best we can. We'll probably have to take a couple of bites of that cherry. That's all right. Now I'm going to take the DA sander and knock the high bits off of this with 80 grit. Done on the panel. Now we go and mix up some more, and we do that all over again. And we'll do that as many times as necessary to fill all of those imperfections in. So here's where we're at. After a first pass with some Bondo, I filled in the really, really low spots. And I've obviously cut the Bondo back with the DA sander. And that's roughing it in. Now, what you can't see on this video is this edge here, for example, has got a lot of waves up and down and up and down in it. And the reason for that is the DA sander has only got a small pad, about 6 inches in diameter. If you're focusing your time in specific areas for any length of time, you'll sand more down in this area than you will next to it, for example. Now, of course, what we want to do is make this panel as flat as possible. So we've got the Bondo filled in the low spots. Now I'll hit it again with another skim coat of Bondo, and then we use a longboard. And the idea behind this longboard is to make sure that we get this panel and this filling area as absolutely dead level as possible. So this is where the hard work comes in and all the hard yards, because you're going to do this manually, but it's an absolute must. If you stick to a DA sander or an orbital sander, you're going to get those waves in there, and that's absolutely what you don't want. The other thing that I found useful is to break the panel down into individual areas. And in this particular case, I'll break it down into quarters. The back, the left and the right, and the front. And the reason that I do that is it can just be a little bit overwhelming if you've got all of these areas to work on. So I target one area at a time, get it so that I'm absolutely happy with it, and then move on to the next area. That's an 80 grit on the longboard, so I'll skim that with some Bondo, and then I'll take my 80 grit longboard and I'll level it off. As I keep mentioning, I'm no expert at this, I'm just an amateur hack, but I haven't found another way to get a straight panel other than using a longboard and a lot of elbow grease. And you can see what I was talking about those waves. Low spot there, low spot there, low spot there, there. So we'll continue to sand that and try and get those low spots out with the longboard, but if it's not getting down to where it needs to, then we're going to have to put another skim coat of Bondo over that. And that's about as far as we're going to get there. I think we've got to now take another skim coat of Bondo and put it across there and spread it up here so it takes in that high spot as well. There's that edge sanded down with 80 grit with the block, with the longboard. So that is dead flat along that edge now, which is exactly what we were looking for. Got a couple of pinholes here and there, so I'll fill that with a really light, almost like a putty, and sand that back down again, but that's well on its way. We'll be able to hit that with a high build primer, and that'll fill out any of the very minor imperfections. So back end nearly done, then we can move on to a side. Now I've laid down Bondo across that entire plane of that panel, and again it's a matter of getting the longboard and sanding all of that back, and probably about 90% of that Bondo will disappear into dust, and the only thing that'll be left is that stuff that sits in and fills the hollows. Time consuming process, but that's what you've got to do to get dead straight and flat panels. Now this side is, for the most part, sanded down. So now I'll spray some etch primer on it as a guide coat and sand that etch primer off and see where the high spots and where the low spots are. So I've sanded off the guide coat here and on the top of the bonnet here, and that all looks really good. There's no low spots or high spots, so we'll move on from there. This side here we've sanded off the guide coat, and we got high spot here, high spot here, high spot sort of running along here. So that's no good. We're going to have to get some more filler and run it along and fill in basically this channel here. This side here looks good, no real low or high spots there, so that's excellent, but that is no good. And that's the reason that you've got to do a guide coat and sand that guide coat off, because without that you wouldn't really be able to see those high and low spots until you hit the thing with paint, and then you look down the panel and you go, Jesus, that's crookeder than a dog's hind leg. So critical that you do this if you want dead straight panels. Big blade a bit more. Okay, side number one is finished. It's all blended in very nicely and now coated with some etch primer. Well, it's been a good solid 3 days of body work since I last touched base, and here's what we've got. All of the Bondo work is completely finished. I've got it sprayed down with a shot of etch primer. It's been sanded down to 120 grit, and now I'm ready to start hitting it with some high build primer. That's the insert that goes into the bonnet, which looks pretty bloody good, I must say. Very happy with how that's turning out. Very happy indeed. That's how she's looking at the moment, and I must say I'm very, very pleased with that. Looks tough. Mr. Toyota, I don't know why you didn't do this in the first place on your 200s, but you should have.